In 1888, 5 women were murdered in London's East End. Their killer was never caught. Over 130 years later, the identity of Jack the Ripper remains the most famous unsolved murder case in history. And some of the suspects will shock you. London. Autumn. 1888. The streets of Whitechapel were dark, narrow, overcrowded. One of the poorest, most desperate corners of the richest city in the world. And in those streets, something was hunting. Between the 31st of August and the 9th of November 1888, 5 women were murdered. Their bodies mutilated with a precision that suggested surgical knowledge. The killer left no witnesses. No reliable evidence. No name. Just letters. Taunting letters sent to the police and the press. Signed with a name that would echo through history. Jack the Ripper. The case was never solved. The killer was never caught. And 130 years later, the mystery remains. But the truth, buried in Victorian archives, in police files, in the history of the East End itself, is darker than most people realize. This is the real story of Jack the Ripper. But to understand Jack the Ripper, you must first understand the world he operated in. Because Whitechapel in 1888 was not just a place of poverty. It was a place where women had almost no protection. And almost no one cared when they died. Whitechapel, in the autumn of 1888, was a world within a world. Just miles from Buckingham Palace. From the Houses of Parliament. From the wealthiest square mile on earth. But separated from all of that by something more than distance. Over 300,000 people were crammed into Whitechapel's narrow streets. Tens of thousands of them immigrants, Jewish refugees fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe. Irish workers. The desperately poor of every nationality. Living in conditions that shocked even the Victorian reformers who came to document them. Entire families in single rooms. Lodging houses where people paid a few pennies to sleep sitting up, a rope strung across the room to lean against. The women who would become the Ripper's victims lived in this world. They were not simply, as Victorian newspapers called them, women of the streets. They were women who had fallen through every crack in Victorian society. Widowed. Abandoned. Driven by poverty to sell the only thing they had left. Their lives were worth almost nothing to the authorities. Their deaths, it seemed, were worth only slightly more. Until the mutilations began. And even the Metropolitan Police could no longer look away. Because what Jack the Ripper did to his victims was not simply murder. It was something that suggested knowledge, skill, a deliberate, calculated message. And it is that message that has driven investigators and historians mad for over a century. The canonical 5. That is what historians call the 5 women most likely killed by Jack the Ripper. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. Each one deserves to be remembered as a person. Mary Ann Nichols was 43 years old. A mother of 5 children. Her marriage had broken down. She had struggled with alcohol. She was found in Bucks Row on the 31st of August 1888. Her throat had been cut twice. Her abdomen mutilated. Annie Chapman was 47. Also a mother. Also separated from her husband. Found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street on the 8th of September. Her throat cut. Her abdomen opened. And certain internal organs removed. With what the police surgeon described as considerable anatomical skill. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were killed on the same night. The 30th of September. The night that became known as the double event. Elizabeth Stride's throat was cut but her body was not mutilated. Investigators believe the Ripper was interrupted. Catherine Eddowes, killed less than an hour later, bore the full force of what had been denied. Mary Jane Kelly was the last. And the worst. She was 25 years old. The youngest of the 5. found in her own room on the 13th of November. Unlike the others, the Ripper had time and privacy. What was done to Mary Jane Kelly in that room was so extreme that experienced police officers were physically unable to remain in the room. The details have never been fully published, and they never should be. These were not victims. They were people, destroyed by someone who was never brought to justice. And then came the letters. Because Jack the Ripper, or someone pretending to be him, began to communicate. And those communications changed everything about how the case was investigated, and how the Ripper became a legend. On the 27th of September 1888, the Central News Agency received a letter, written in red ink, taunting the police, boasting of the murders, promising more, and signed, for the first time, for Jack the Ripper. The letter became known as the Dear Boss letter. It was followed, 2 days later, by a postcard, the Saucy Jack postcard, which referred to the double event, the murder of 2 women in one night, sent before the details were public. Or so it appeared. And then, the most disturbing communication of all. A small parcel sent to George Lusk, the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. Inside the parcel was a letter, and half a preserved human kidney. The letter claimed it was the kidney of Catherine Eddowes. A doctor who examined it said it had come from a woman of around 45 years old, who had suffered from Bright's disease, as had Catherine Eddowes. Most historians today believe the majority of Ripper letters were hoaxes, sent by journalists trying to sell newspapers. But the kidney has never been fully explained. And the letter that came with it, signed from hell, is the one that most investigators believe was genuine. Because whoever sent it was not seeking fame. They were not seeking attention. They were sending a piece of a human being through the post, and daring anyone to stop them. The investigation that followed was one of the largest in Victorian history. And the list of suspects it produced is one of the most extraordinary and disturbing in the history of crime. Over the past 130 years, more than 100 suspects have been named as Jack the Ripper. But several stand above the rest. The first, and most disturbing, is Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence, Queen Victoria's grandson, second in line to the throne of England. The theory, never proven and largely dismissed by serious historians, suggests that the murders were a royal cover-up, that the women knew a secret about the prince, and were silenced. More credible suspects include Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jewish immigrant living in Whitechapel, who was committed to a lunatic asylum shortly after the murders stopped, who was identified in a police memorandum as the most likely suspect, and who, in 2014, was identified through DNA evidence found on a shawl allegedly belonging to Catherine Eddowes, though that DNA evidence remains deeply contested. Another serious suspect is Montague John Drute, a barrister and school teacher, whose body was pulled from the Thames in December 1888, weeks after the last murder, who was privately identified by the head of the Metropolitan Police as the most likely suspect, and whose family, according to that same memorandum, believed him to have been the killer. And then there is H.H. Holmes, America's first documented serial killer, who was in London in 1888, whose methods bore striking similarities to the Rippers, and who later confessed, in a document discovered after his death, to being Jack the Ripper, a confession that most historians consider unreliable, but that has never been definitively disproven. But Jack the Ripper was not just a murderer. He was something the world had never quite seen before. And what he created, what he left behind, changed the way the world thinks about crime forever. Jack the Ripper was the first modern serial killer. Not in terms of being the first person to commit multiple murders, but in terms of being the first killer whose crimes were covered in real time by a mass media. The London newspapers of 1888 reported every detail, every rumor, every theory. They printed the letters. They named suspects. They created the myth. Jack the Ripper became a character. A figure of darkness larger than any individual murderer. The press coverage created something new. The serial killer as cultural phenomenon. And in doing so, it created something else. The template for every true crime story that followed. The Ripper case also changed policing. The Metropolitan Police used the investigation to develop new forensic techniques. New methods of evidence gathering. New approaches to witness interviewing. The failures of the investigation led directly to the creation of the Criminal Investigation Department as it exists today. And Whitechapel itself was changed forever. The murders brought middle-class reformers into the East End in a way that years of campaigning had not. The shock of the crimes forced Victorian society to confront the poverty, the danger, and the desperation in which the victims had lived. And died. Jack the Ripper was never caught. But the world he forced into existence, a world of forensic science, criminal psychology, true crime media, is the world we live in today. And the case itself, the files, the evidence, the letters, still exists. Still being studied. Still producing new theories. And one discovery, made in the last decade, has come closer than anything before to finally naming Jack the Ripper. In 2014, businessman Russell Edwards purchased a shawl at auction, claimed to have been found at the scene of Catherine Eddowes' murder, and kept by the police officer who found it. Edwards commissioned DNA analysis of the shawl, working with forensic scientist Dr. Jori Louhilainen. What they found was extraordinary. Mitochondrial DNA matching a living descendant of Catherine Eddowes. And mitochondrial DNA matching a living descendant of Aaron Kosminski, the Polish immigrant, the lunatic asylum patient, the man named in police memoranda as the most likely suspect. The results were published and immediately contested. Critics pointed to chain of custody issues, to the possibility of contamination, to methodological questions about the DNA analysis itself. In 2019, the same team published a follow-up paper, claiming to have identified a genetic mutation unique to Kosminski's family line, found on the shawl. The debate continues. The case remains officially unsolved. But for the first time in 130 years, there is scientific evidence, however contested, pointing at a specific individual. Aaron Kosminski, a frightened, mentally ill immigrant, living in the same streets as his victims, may have been the most infamous killer in history. Or may not. The truth, like the man himself, remains in the shadows. Jack the Ripper killed 5 women in 11 weeks in the autumn of 1888 and was never caught. The case created the modern true crime genre. It created modern forensic investigation. It forced Victorian society to confront what it had chosen not to see. And it left behind a mystery that 130 years of investigation, technology, and obsession have not fully solved. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. 5 women. 5 names. Who deserved better than the world they lived in, and better than to be remembered only as the victims of the man who killed them. Subscribe to Veil of Europa. Every week, we uncover the dark history Europe tried to forget. The unsolved. The buried. The deliberately hidden. We'll see you in the shadows.